Thank you, David, for the introduction, and thank you for being here for my presentation tonight. My presentation today is based on my dissertation at Harvard, which I hope to defend soon. So I will first introduce the overall argument of the dissertation, and then I'll present portions of 2 chapters. Sometime in the mid-17th century, the poet Mir Rukneddin, a resident of Isfahan, composed a letter to his friend and fellow poet Mir Muhammad Mansour of Semnan, who went by the pen name of Ashiq, meaning lover. In his melancholic letter, Rukneddin wrote of his sufferings and loneliness since his friend's departure from Isfahan, noting how strolling in a garden or sitting in a coffee house now invoked the memories of his departed companion. To further entice his friend to return, Rukneddin particularly referred to the newest architectural addition to Isfahan's landscape, the Hassanabad or Khaju Bridge. The construction of the bridge was begun by the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas II in 1658, and in the spring of the following year, the bridge was seen of an extravagant royal ceremony followed by a month of reveling and feasting by the Zayanda River. If only a line were written on the glory of this new bridge, Rukneddin wrote, one would swiftly set off for Isfahan. In his response letter, Semnani too complained about, quote, sadness of expatriation and hardship of separation, unquote. Yet, unlike his distressed friend, he limited conventional expressions of sorrow to a brief opening passage. Instead, he wrote that he would offer a guide, Dastur al-Amal, for a one-day tour of Isfahan, and wittily hinted at the mandatory character of his proposed journey. He wrote, after complaining of separation and expressing desire, a guide on the subject of strolling in markets, roving in flower gardens, and beholding faces is written by the pen of expression. It is not permissible to stray nor to retract from this path. It was my mind's will to write an extensive guide with restorative description on each subject, but since there was no sufficient time, the mind contented itself to a sample. Yet, despite the author's claim at brevity, Dastur al-Amal Seyr Isfahan, Manual for Strolling in Isfahan, penned by Agha Mansour, as the author was known in contemporary sources, portrays a vivid representation of Safavid Isfahan. Alternating between rhymed prose and verse, it leads the reader through the city's markets, coffee houses, plazas, and mosques, and describes Isfahan's vendors, artisans, cupbearers, coffee servers, jesters, and courtesans. While the incessant flow of prose conveys a sense of movement in space, the verses evoke moments of hiatus in both time and space. Beginning at dawn and at midnight, the city tour involves a staggering range of sensory pleasures. In the course of the day, one would visit coffee houses, a hookah stall, a sherbet house, and a royal market, among many other places, and many of these were located around Isfahan's central Maidan or Maidan-e-Nakhsh Jahan. The day-long journey culminates in a nocturnal union with the author's favorite courtesan. The main figures of the narrative are Isfahan's young male artisans, who are described through a set of metaphors derived from the commodities they sell or from the crafts in which they are engaged. And this is in keeping with the literary genre of Shahrashub, meaning literally city disturber. But while the stores and workshops of the bazaar, the locus of male beauties, make up the bulk of the narrative, the urban excursion also includes visits to several monuments. Indeed, despite the diversity of these locales, a close examination of their sequence reveals that they constitute a fairly clear spatial trajectory. The itinerary is so realistic that one can trace the journey on the map of Safavid Isfahan. The city experience that informs this literary imagination lies at the heart of my dissertation. Through an integrative analysis of the urban structure of the city and a corpus of literary sources that deal with its experience in spaces, I show how the city is structured, the experience of its dwellers and visitors, and fostered novel modes of perceiving and representing the built environment. Safavid Isfahan, I argue, did not merely embody a grandiose imperial vision, it also fashioned a material world brimming with new commodities and sensations. It was the city that amalgamated a diverse set of material artifacts, urban elements, and humans in a unified whole, allowing a visitor to immerse himself in a swirl of senses, places, and humans. Without the city, the drifting persona of Agha Mansour's narrative would not have existed. In the middle years of the 17th century, when Agha Mansour and his fellow poets had begun to verbalize their city experience, Isfahan was at the height of its material prosperity and physical expansion. Initiated by Shah Abbas in the 1590s, the massive urban project covered a vast area in the southern outskirts of medieval Isfahan on the banks of the Zayanda Rud. The centerpiece of the urban plan was Maidan Nakhsh Jahan, plan of the World Square, an enormous urban plaza erected on the eastern side of a pre-existing garden of the same name, Bagh Nakhsh Jahan, which was reconfigured to house the royal residence and various private palaces. The fulcrum of the new city, however, was the Chahar Bagh, or Khiyaban Chahar Bagh, a tree-lined promenade that stretched from a gate of the old town located in the vicinity of the royal residence to an enormous royal suburban garden known as Abbasabad Garden or Hazar Jarib Garden. To the western side of the Chahar Bagh was the neighborhood of Abbasabad, settled by a community of merchants from Tabriz who were forced to migrate to Isfahan from the northwest province of Azerbaijan, and across the river was the suburb of New Julfa, which was inhabited by Armenian merchants who were active in international silk trade. The settling of these mercantile communities in a new capital city was an integral part of a broader program of socio-economic reforms set in motion by Shah Abbas. Paving the ground for these reforms was a succession of military conquests. Over the course of the 1590s and early 1600s, the Safavid army, reinvigorated by an expanded regiment of slave soldiers or gholams, steadily conquered the domain seized by its regional rivals, the Ottomans and the Uzbeks. In the meantime, to take advantage of the expansion of European maritime trade networks, Abbas embarked on a plan to mobilize the productive forces of his territories. To bolster mercantile connections, a far-flung network of caravansarais and roads were constructed. The construction of Isfahan was a key component of this massive territorial plan for the revival of trade and reorganization of socio-political order. It was a building program intended to carve out a space for the Safavids in the emerging world system. Throughout the 17th century, Isfahan lay at the center of a landscape reconfigured through a vast infrastructural network, traversed by an unprecedented flow of commodities and humans. In my dissertation, I argue that these new denizens and their attendant material cultures and social milieus were integral to the spatial conception of Isfahan. I show that the new city was more than just a cluster of monumental urban spaces and gardens created at a fortunate moment in a sealed civilizational trajectory. It was rather a cosmopolitan habitat of living and trade, where the silver of the New World was exchanged for silk, where coffee and tobacco were consumed as totally new commodities in public spaces. So the two chapters that I'll be presenting today, portion materials from these two chapters I'll present today look specifically at three literary sources composed in the middle decades of the 17th century. So one chapter focuses on the Manual of Strolling in Isfahan, composed by Agha Mansour, and the other one draws on two other literary sources. One is Masir al-Salikin, Path of Wayfarers, composed in 1675 by a poet known as Mir Nejad, and Saqi Nameh, Book of Cupbearers, composed by Tahir Wahid. But before going to my the first chapter and following the parts of the tour guide of Agha Mansour, I would like to say a few words about the author. So we can sketch out a biography of him by what is available in scattered sources. So we know he was a son of a poet from Semnan. He settles in Isfahan at a young age, seeks royal patronage, and even composes a panegyric for a new royal garden. Apparently it doesn't lead anywhere, so he leaves the city, moves back to his hometown, Semnan, and there he builds a coffee house and lives for a long time, apparently. So, so the manual was probably composed when he was at a very young age. So we see here the trope of a young man from the provinces coming, if you will, to the metropolis and having this experience. So the letter, the Insha, was probably sent from Semnan to Isfahan, and we have evidence that there was a continued exchange between Agha Mansour and his former companions in Isfahan. And so in terms of format, it is simultaneously a letter, a composition, or insha, but it's also a shahrashub, city disturber, but it's also perhaps in a humorous way a manual, but it's none of them at the same time, because it's subverting all these literary genres by combining them with one another. And writing shahrashub in prose appears to be a literary novelty of the period. There are at least four shahrashubs in prose dating from mid-17th century dealing with Isfahan. So now let's follow parts of his tour of Isfahan. The tour of Isfahan begins shortly after dawn at Bazarche Timche market, where, quote, one should have a morning wine, sabuhi, from the ecstasy of beholding the tobacco vendor and alleviate the intensity of hangover, khomari, unquote. It seems that the imagined visitor has already woken up from a night of imbibing and reveling. One is then instructed to pass by the shops of Armenian infidel boys, kafar bachehay Armani. The reference to Armenian shop owners in the main market of Isfahan, corroborated by other sources, is indicative of the degree to which they were integrated into the city's social fabric. One Italian traveler, Bembo, notes that although Armenians live in Julfa, quote, they have shops in Isfahan where they stay during the day, unquote. The exact location of the tobacco shop and the shops run by Armenians are not quite clear, but they were probably located on the northwestern side of the Maidan, as afterwards the text guides us towards the coffee houses and the royal market Qaysariya, which was located on the north side of the Maidan. Constructed in the year 1602 as part of the coffee houses were part of the main building program of the Maidan as it was constructed under Shah Abbas, occupying the entire eastern wing of the plaza's northern side, what is today known as Bazar Sarrafha, market of money changers. They consisted of 6 domed halls with chamfered corners, each approximately 7 meters across. Each domed chamber was lit through an aperture in the ceiling and featured an octagonal basin at the center. Alternating with these domed halls were barrel vaulted spaces which were provided with platforms used as sitting areas for the clients of the coffee house. In addition to the eastern and western entrances, the coffee houses were directly accessible from the open-air space of the Maidan and probably from the market in the rear. This reconstruction is based on a couple of sources. I talk about them in my paper on coffee houses. There is this drawing by Pietro della Valle, an Italian traveler in the early 17th century. He did this sketch of the Maidan coffee houses, and it matches an early 1933 plan of Isfahan, which shows the original configuration of coffee houses and traces the original vaulting of the coffee houses still remains in situ. At least 4 bays still remain, but they are taken over by shops now. Agha Mansour's recommended path matches the configuration of coffee houses in the northern side of the Maidan. As he writes, one should then head towards the Qaysariya via the path that runs through and behind the coffee houses, and it is permissible for smoking a water pipe at the stall of Saleh Khas Khan, and if one's temperament is inclined towards coffee, one can get a cup from the hand of Mirza Ashraf at Khaja Ali Coffee House. So what he refers to as the path through Mabain Coffee, Mabain Qahwa, through the coffee houses and behind the coffee houses matches this peculiar configuration of coffee houses on the Maidan. And his reference to these particular servers or persons who ran the coffee houses is also consistent with other sources, although they were spatially interconnected and similar in form. Each coffee house had a different character. It was run by a different person who was known as known after a particularly handsome server. Yeah, and there were many of them. At the and here's just a hypothetical reconstruction of the recommended path: getting a water pipe and then getting a coffee in a coffee house and just leisurely heading towards the portal of Qaysariya. At the portal, the primary attraction is the unnamed jewel seller. The poet uses the imagery related to jewels to offer broad metaphors of love. One is then advised to rest in front of the platform of the syrup store, Dokanche Salab Paziv Shire Furushi, and drink a cup or two of salab. So it was a type of hot drink made from the powdered root of salab, or Orchis mascula, that's the technical term. And drink a cup, but this is not just for the sake of the drink. Directly in front of the shop would be, quote, the moon-like jewel seller beloved, Mah Delbar. The two main trades at the entrance of the entrance portal are thus combined to form a literary image marked by synesthesia, invoking the main sensory pleasures available at the Qaysariya entrance. Another remarkable aspect of this description of the Qaysariya is the presence of astronomical imagery, and this is all related. So he refers to the portal as auspicious zodiac sign of the star of felicity, and this is also represented in tile panels, and the zodiac sign of Sagittarius, which is the symbol of Isfahan, and under its auspicious, the city had been built under the Buyids originally in the 11th century. And so in some surrounded by coffee houses, sharbat shops, and confectionaries, this five-sided recess in front of the Qaysariya portal was one of the main urban nodes of Isfahan, and the availability of pastries, coffee, tobacco, and other sorts of pleasure turned it into one of the city's primary centers of urban leisure. Then is one to explore the market's interior. The author compares the Qaysariya to Egypt, Misr, which one would go to buy the beauty of Joseph. And then in an extended sentence containing a wide range of technical commercial terms and names of fabrics, the text conjures up a vivid picture of the sartorial commodities that are produced and traded in the market. The incessant swirl of images conveys a sense of the space of the variegated textiles traded and made in the royal cloth market. Qaysariya market was a popular destination and figures in every literary description of the city. Its appeals was not unlike the lure of the shopping mall in the 20th century. Not only was it the largest covered market of the entire city, but also a cosmopolitan center of trade where luxurious textiles and exotic commodities and even European prints and paintings were sold, and people of different ethnicities could be met. Not everyone had the means to afford the commodities and substances, of course, but all could take delight in being around them, seeking pleasure in the very same articles of trade whose circulation made such an urban exploration possible. After exploring the Qaysariya, the tour continues in the area around the royal market, So one is to pass through two caravansarais, Yazdi and Kashi, which were located. The exact location is not clear, but behind the Qaysariya market. And then one would reach the Chaharsu of Madrasa Mullah Abdullah, whose position is clear, and she's still standing, the madrasa. And thus it appears that the visitor is supposed to exit the Qaysariya through a rear gate and pass through these caravansarais, making a U-turn to get back to the northeast of the Maidan. Then hunger prevails. For the light meal, the author recommends two types of bread, sangak and lavash, each from certain bakers, to be had with a specific, and he gives all the names of these, and this is one of the tropes of a prosperous city, of cheese, yogurt, grape, peach, watermelon, and melon, and so it was not really light. After the meal, the tour takes a new turn. Now one is to visit the Qahweh Saz, a coffee house of musical instrument. The location of this drinking house is not specified, but at least one other source refers to is the specific Qahweh Saz, so it seems that it's not a generic term, but a specific place. The atmosphere of this drinking house is fairly distinct from the coffee houses at the market. So there you could go and make a short stop for a cup of coffee or a water pipe, but there is usually no time for lingering and relishing dancing and music. So it seems that there were two types of coffee houses in Isfahan. One was for conversation, for sohbat. One was for leisure, for ishrat. So this is what this Qahweh Saz was, one of these coffee houses for leisure. And so these coffee houses had bands of musicians. There probably wine was also served. So in his description of this drinking house, Agha Mansour paints an animated picture of a festive, jubilant assembly of drunken revelers enlivened by music, singing, and dancing. Here is the largest agglomeration of beloveds, quote, all with bewitching European eyes. Jadunagahan Farangi. I think contemporary paintings offer a glimpse of the atmosphere that Agha Mansour tries to paint with, the festive atmosphere with music being played and servers, with shiny garments and similar phenomena. Departing from the drinking house, the visitor is to return to the market around the Maidan, passing through the shoemaker's market, Bazar Kafashha, which is located here. One would reach the gateway of the royal palace complex, Dar Dolat Khane, which means the Ali Qapu, which is located here. But then at this point, the author suggests an idiosyncratic activity to visit Talar Tawile, Hall of Stables, to see European images, Tasavir Farang, so as to remove dust from the mind by beholding European images. And in our last palace with a pillared semi-open hall, Talar Tawile was located behind the Ali Qapu within the palace ground, and since its erection under Shah Safi in the 1630s, functioned as the court's main reception hall. Adam Olearius, a German visitor who attended an audience with Shah Safi at Talar Tawile in 1637, noted that paintings were hung on the walls, easel paintings were hung on the walls. So it is likely that these paintings were, and they're represented here, so it is likely that these paintings were what our text refers to as European images. But even more striking in this passage is that there is no reference to royal presence. It seems as if the palace was an integral part of the city and the Maidan, and could function as a public museum of some sort, if you will. European accounts suggest that Safavid royal palaces and gardens were generally open to the public. Chardin and Kampfer, two of the most famous visitors who visited Isfahan in the 17th century, were able to visit, at least they claim to be able to visit, the inner parts of the palace complex, of course in the absence of the Shah. Our text provides evidence from within the culture that this accessibility was probably common at least among local elites. After this short detour from the market, the visitor is instructed to go through the lane of lapidaries, Raste Hakkakan, towards the market of vendors of small wares, Bazar Khorde Furushan, and the mirror market. Passing through these passing these markets, one would reach the portal of the Congregational Mosque, Masjid al-Jami. What he means is the Shah Mosque, Masjid al-Jami Abbasi. Here there is an Attari, a shop selling medicinal herbs and perfumes, where one again could seek cure for the fever of separation. Then, in a theatrical coincidence, just as the visitor reaches the portal, this comes the time for the noon prayers, and the sound of call for prayers fills the heavens. The tour then takes us inside the mosque and alludes to people engaged in prayer and recitation of the Quran. There's no invitation to join the prayer. So here is the summary of the places that we have so far explored. So I'm going to follow the rest of the tour with a faster pace. So until this point, we were visiting the new Maidan. Then a journey to the old city is recommended. He wrote, after leaving the mosque, if supposedly it is Friday and time is expanded, one is to don the robe of pilgrimage and set off with no hesitation for visiting the old mosque. The old Maidan was connected to the Maidan Nakhsh Jahan new Safavid Square through a 2-kilometer-long covered market. Along the entire way amid the markets, one should stroll and behold the beauties, quote, like the morning breeze in the field of flowers, unquote. But while enjoying the beauties in passing, we should not pause along the way until reaching the Takhtgah, located on the east and the south side of the old Maidan. Takhtgah, literally throne place, was an elongated space adjacent to the shrine of Harun Velayat, which was the most popular shrine of the city and was famous for its multiple drinking houses. According to Agha Mansour, here one can smoke a water type, drink a cup of coffee, and of course relish the beauties. Oh, and here's a reconstruction of the area. So this is the tomb chamber of Harun Velayat. So the area dates from the time of Shah Ismail, early 16th century, but maybe it had some sort of function related to Safavid, rituals of Safavid orders. But in the 17th century, it was famous for its coffee houses. Following this visit, one should go to the congregation, Old Friday Mosque, Masjid al-Jami Qadim, which is also located in the vicinity of the old Maidan, and here's a view from the rooftop of the old mosque, looking towards the shrine of Harun al-Velayat on the other corner of the old Maidan. He extols the mosque as the manifestation of grace, faith, and judging from his description, in his mind, the old mosque was superior to the new Safavid Congregational Mosque. But when the visitor reaches the old mosque, the prayer time has already passed, so one would miss, quote, the bliss of following Muhammad Taqi Majlisi in congregational prayer. So this is another excuse not to join the prayer. But it's also an interesting attempt at realism, because at the time of the noon prayer, the visitor is in the new Maidan, so it will take some time to get to the old Maidan. So, I mean, there are these little attempts at realism. Then the text takes us back to the Maidan, because at nightfall, it's so crowded, it's like the day of resurrection. And literally in these old photos, it looks like the day of resurrection. And then, then there was the whole Maidan was covered with sand, and so there are then the Maidan at nightfall is filled with all sorts of entertainers, jugglers, acrobats, wrestlers, and he dwells on some of them. He describes his favorite wrestler and another one, but then comes the darkness of night and time for union with the author's favorite courtesan, which he describes in a very long poem. So another interesting part is that he first alludes to prostitutes in the old city, but he says that I don't recommend them. You have to deal with, all sorts of people, but here is this, very good courtesan that I recommend. So in conclusion, I would like to highlight two main features of the text. One is its literary form. So the main feature that distinguishes Agha Mansour's work from its earlier and contemporary prototypes is the realistic representation of the city. Almost all the beauties and attractions are individualized and spatialized. Here, the city and its spaces do not merely form an overarching heading for a set of poems on craftsmen as the literary genre of Shahrashub used to be, but are rather integrated into the very fabric of the narrative. The piece is also characterized by a relatively short duration of its account, just one day. And this is another literary device that further dramatizes the intensity of available sources of sensorial pleasure in Safavid Isfahan. Fleeting moments of pleasure are given a new meaning by being incorporated into a coherent spatio-temporal narrative informed by a theatrical unity in both time and space. And also, one needs to consider all the novel commodities, social venues, and objects that make up the tour: coffee houses, tobacco shops, Armenian vendors, European paintings, etc. Virtually non-existent half a century earlier, the introduction of these new features was closely entangled with the construction of the new Isfahan. It was indeed the harmonious integration of these novel social practices and commodities into spatial rhythms of the city that engendered the unique urban experience that underlies Agha Mansour's composition. Modes and levels of visual and spatial engagement. Composed in the year 1608, the narrative penned by the chronicler Junabadi is the most comprehensive account of the construction of Isfahan under Shah Abbas that has come down to us. Unlike the works of other annalists, here the various stages of the city's construction are not reported as a set of separate events scattered in time, but are rather integrated into a coherent narrative with a beginning, middle, and an end. And I'm following the classic work of Hayden White in making this distinction. A similar sense of coherence and attention to details characterizes Junabadi's description of the urban form and architectural components of the new Isfahan. Consider, for instance, the following passage. Then a 50 cubit wide avenue was laid out from Abbasabad as far as Dawlat Gate, a distance of 1 farsakh. According to the world-obeying order, the Khans, great emirs, viziers, and sads erected fine Chaharbagh parks, each to his own taste and opposite one another, along both sides of the avenue. Even if we knew nothing else about the Chaharbagh, it would still be possible to draw a scaled schematic plan of the entire project based on this description. We have the width, we have the length, we have the beginning, we have the end, but we have the rows of paired gardens. This mode of description stands in a stark contrast to the urban imagination that underlies Agha Mansour's composition. Junabadi's narrative embodies a panoptic vision. It gives an image of the entire project from an elevated point of view, befitting the intended royal audience of a chronicle. By contrast, Agha Mansour's compass manual represents the city from the viewpoint of a moving beholder. Rather than a spectacle, a grand scheme of plazas and boulevards under the monarch's gaze, here the city is represented from an ordinary human level through a myriad of bodily interactions and sensations. In a sense, these two accounts represent two successive episodes in the city's existence: the moment of its creation as a cluster of massive geometric compositions, and that of its infusion with humans, commodities, and sensations half a century later. But in fact, these two modes of engaging with the built environment were not mutually exclusive, but rather represent two ends of a gradient. Indeed, the literary works that deal with Isfahan exhibit both modes of engagement. They either share the imperial gaze or operate at the human level. As such, these literary works provide unique insights into the nature of the urban plan of Isfahan, its visual structure, and the ways in which they were the ways in which it revealed itself to contemporary visitors. So in this chapter, I analyzed the visual structure of the new city in terms of three intertwined modes of optical and spatial engagement. One is panoramic, as the city could be viewed from afar, from high points. The other is perspectival, as the city was experienced through specific focal points, and the third one is multifocal, as it experienced through bodily movements through the city. But here I would like to focus more on this mode of kinetic urban experience and compare it to the experience that is suggested by Agha Mansour's composition. Indeed, the composition is not the only literary work on Isfahan that is characterized by spatial realism. Two other works, notably Masir al-Salikin, Path of Wayfarers by Mir Nejat, and Saqi Name, are also examples of that kind of realistic representation. Both works deal extensively with the Maidan and Charbagh, but focus on different elements and conjure up distinctive routes. It's maybe useful to talk a little bit about the term that is used for this type of strolling. It's Sayr Kardan, which combines the Persian verb with the Arabic root sayr, which means to move, to go around. So sayr was primarily kinetic linguistically, but through bodily movement in space, but it could also be stationary with eyes wandering on the urban landscape. Sayr could be solitary or collective. So this is like an inherited concept that is assuming these new meanings in the urban context of Isfahan. Composed in 1675, Masir al-Salikin is a poem of 1,200 couplets. It is an autobiographical port on the travels of the author, a portion of which is dedicated to Isfahan. Mir Nejat's verses indicate that he belonged to the very same urban milieu that informed the persona of Agha Mansour's composition. It suggests how he and his companions would spend their days in coffee houses from dawn to dusk, moving from one coffee house to another, seeking youthful beauty or listening to a Shahnameh reciter. Mir Nejat's portrayal of Isfahan, however, begins not with a youthful beauty, but rather at the city's most prominent monument, the Shah Mosque, the new congregational mosque. After a generic description of the city, which refers to its vastness, walls, and bastions, the poet refers to Isfahan's high edifices, shrines, and mosques, of which he singles out the congregational mosque, which, quote, "the ages have not seen its semblance in Iran." The poem is, the poem is structured, so this is messed up, but I'll tell you what I want to say. So the poem is structured around specific elements of the mosque. So elements like, sorry for not having the translation, like Mehrab, Shabastan, Sofe, the pool, and stone pavement. But, and he either, so his description oscillates between the symbolic association or physical features of these elements, but an analysis of their sequence suggests that these were not random elements, but rather follow a clear trajectory within the mosque itself. So it started with the mihrab, prayer niche, the sanctuary, the main Ivan, the pool, the stone pavement, dalan, the corridor, and then the portal. So this is a different type of description starting from the prayer niche of the mosque. The poet then takes us from the mosque to the Maidan through a picture as seen from the mosque's door. I don't know if this is the correct translation, but the Maidan is visible from the mosque's door in 100 beehives, like the tear on the garment of lovers. I don't know how to relate that to and then the poet then describes the Maidan. He likens it to a boundless sea, a desert within a desert. It is like the sound of a nightingale with 100 songs and instruments. But then the description shifts from the Maidan to its coffee houses. Coffee houses are available in front, like the arches of the brows of cruel beloved. So what is interesting here is how the signal word namayan, visible, which has to do with vision, to shift the focus from the mosque to the Maidan, he used this picture, namayan, vision, viewing the Maidan, and then from the Maidan, viewing the coffee houses in the north side of the Maidan. And then Mir Nejat, there's a short section on the Qaysariya, and he ends his description with Dar al-Shafa, or Royal Hospital, which was located on the north side of the Maidan. So pretty straightforward, trajectory following the axial configuration of Maidan, which is very, very different from the more playful trajectory of Agha Mansur. In a separate section, Mir Nejat also includes a description of the Charbagh, which is conceived, has its own sayr, its own strolling, and he refers to plane trees, canals, and walkways. He also alludes to the bordering pavilion, the nalas bordering tekyas or Sufi lodges of the Charbagh, and the pools that used to be in front of them. Then he takes us to the bridge, and there's a long section on the bridge, but then he suddenly takes us from the bridge to the Lomban Mosque. And the reason that this obscure mosque is very interesting is because Muhammad Tahir Nasrabadi, who was a prominent literary figure of the age, decides in the 1670s to seclude himself in the mosque and builds a coffee house for himself there. And the coffee house is probably the structure that is still standing in the rear area of the mosque. So this is the end of his tour of the Charbagh. In his Saqi-Name, Tahir Wahid also dedicates a substantial section to the Charbagh, where the Saqi is summoned to the Charbagh holding the pitcher in hand. So this is the convention of the genre. Each subsection starts with a call to the cupbearer, to the Saqi. But unlike Mir Nejat, he even follows a more straightforward trajectory, and this is consistent with his career and personality. He's a bureaucrat par excellence. So he served as the analyst under Shah Abbas II, then became a wazir, and so he's very following the axis of the space. And he describes the trees, canals, and pools, and then the bridge, but then he takes us all the way to the portal of the Hezar Jarib garden. He dwells on the portal for a few couplets, but yet for him the tour does not even end there. He even takes us inside the garden, describes a specific pool with two flanking pavilions. It matches so the garden is now gone, but these drawings by Kampfer suggest that there was a pool with two flanking pavilions, but it even doesn't culminate there with the garden. It even takes us further uphill to the Safa mountain, and this is both a spatial and thematic strategy, as the viewing tower, which is now doesn't exist, was developed under Shah Suleiman, to whom he reigned in the third quarter of the 17th century, and to whom Wahid's poem is dedicated. So this is again another interesting journey in terms of the shifts in vision. So it starts with this perspectival bodily mode of vision, and it gradually, as one moves along down the Charbagh, transforms into this panoramic vision from atop the mountain. So it allows him to conclude his journey at an elevated point where Isfahan reveals itself as this total plan again. And this is probably a nice place for me to conclude this presentation as well. So the differences between these three works that I briefly introduced here is indicative of the multiplicity of responses to the city and the urban subjectivities that made up the publics of Safavid Isfahan. Together, these works are indicative of the emergence of a new consciousness of space and time, and by extension of one's place in the world. Nothing like this was possible without the city and the social setting that it informed and accommodated. Thank you.